Scientists, what is the worst thing that has happened in your lab? A girl in my lab forgot to turn the blower on in the hood and inhaled a small amount of an E. coli toxin we were supposed to put in solution. Didn't feel well, went to the ER, got pneumonia, then got an intestinal infection. Her mom had to fly to the East Coast from California to take care of her when she couldn't leave her apartment for 2 weeks. It's a month later and she still hasn't fully recovered. Grad student left a hot plate on, burned down her advisor's lab, entire floor of the building destroyed by smoke and water damage. Nobody killed, but the advisor's rare collection of butterfly wings went up in smoke. He'd been studying evolution of butterflies and had to abandon that. Took about a year to rebuild everything and get back on track. That was 20 years ago, and I still have a big sign in the lab where people will see it when they leave. Is the hot plate OFF? Edit, forgot to mention severe water damage in the entire rest of the building. The affected lab was on the top floor, so the whole department was pretty much flooded. We were all shut down for a while. I ended up staying in grad school another year because of all the delays getting the labs up and running again. Really dumb, postdoc in my previous lab placed an unrinsed bottle in the bleach bath to be picked up by the glassware folks. She didn't sink it, just left it floating. When the glassware guy got up there, he sank it to rinse, clean it. Too bad the bottle had a bit of HCl in there, and created chlorine gas when he sank it into the bleach water. A staff scientist found him passed out next to the sink. Edit, because a couple people have asked. No, he didn't die. A visit to campus medical, I'm sure, but those facilities folks are made of stronger stuff than I am. I was an undergrad, getting some experience in a mosquito genetics lab. I heeded my copious amounts of safety and PPE training, and always made sure to wear pants, closed-toed shoes, gloves, and goggles. However, contrary to what my professors had always told me, absolutely nobody else gave a shit about wearing PPE. After a decent while of being teased by my supervisors and fellow undergrads, I decided to cast off my previous training and wear shorts and sandals. On that very day, we were moving some glass mosquito cages around the lab. The bottom fell out, shattering not only glass, but also a swarm of live mosquitoes all over the floor. And my feet. I wear PPE again now. Anyone who teased you for wearing proper PPE should not be working in a lab. I hope they got punished. I'm a lab manager, where do I begin? The worst one I have seen is when someone placed a vial of some HCl on a top shelf, then threw a giant funnel up there as well, you know, for fun. Of course the funnel rolled around, hit the bottle of HCl and came crashing down on one of my co-workers. She handled it with grace, ran into the shower immediately, and I got to go on a shopping trip and buy her some new clothes. Also saw some get hit in the eye with Trizol and mouse guts at the same time. They did not handle it with grace. Just last week someone set a beaker of ethanol on fire and just stared at it unsure of what to do. Thankfully I was right there and moved the even bigger beaker of ethanol out of the way before it caught on fire. I spilled a load of 35% NaOH solution over myself. Burned right through my coat, overalls, and pants. Quickly pulled down my pants and ran half naked to the showers. The pain and humiliation. I've never been more angry with myself. Third-year chemistry student chucked a lump of sodium in the aqueous waste, chemicals dissolved in water that can't go down the sink, by mistake. Blew the container apart and ignited at least one of the more flammable waste containers it was next to, which blew the fume cupboard apart and a hole in the wall. After that everyone in the university had to fill in a full COSHH assessment for every single lab, no matter what it involved. We do a lot of field work in my lab, all by scuba. I've had lab mates lost at sea, we found them after a few hours, threatened by aggressive sharks, our boat almost capsized during a storm, couple broken bones and injuries. Once another boat almost dropped an anchor on my dive buddy, if it had hit him I wouldn't have known until it was too late. Science can be dangerous. Various stories from around the lab, co-worker accidentally spilled a mercaptan in a hood. Being a shitty old building, the entire building filled up with the smell and had to be evacuated for the day. Mouth pipetting by experienced techs, organic solvents of all things. We had the proper equipment, they were just too lazy to get it. There was a communication issue, and someone threw out about $20,000 worth of samples. Many years before my time, it was accepted practice to heat your lunch in the GC oven. Or to even make French toast. Guess the ovens were so precise temperature-wise it made awesome food. An undergrad intern was autoclaving large glass containers and screwed the threaded tops in as tight as she could. Then she brought them downstairs and left them to cool in our lab. Luckily, we were all out at lunch when the lab absolutely exploded in glass shards and death. We found shards wedged into the back of our lab chairs, notebooks, etc. A postdoctoral fellow was hired, did not learn anything, didn't keep appointments, taught us shady behavior methods when he did, and disappeared in the middle of the night after collecting his stuff, and some of ours. One of our grad students who was friends with this guy showed up in the lab while he was packing, but didn't notice what was going on. Student was like, "See you tomorrow?" And that bastard said, yeah, see you tomorrow. We're still bitter about that. Previous postdoc in my lab had a bad habit of pushing hair away from her face whilst wearing gloves. She continued this habit whilst making her own polyacrylamide gels for protein separation. Only figured out it was very bad when her hair started to fall out in a very specific spot on her head. I'm an astronomer, so most of my work is done on my laptop either in my office at work or at home. My biggest screw-up occurred one early morning when I was using a rather large radio telescope to observe a distant galaxy. However, looking at the data I noticed the galaxy just wasn't there. After a few frantic minutes I realized I had the telescope pointed awry off of the source and just wasted many precious hours of telescope time pointing at a blank sky. I'm still getting shit for that one. As someone in condensed matter physics, who doesn't do material synthesis, I feel like the worst things we can do is cause a waste of time or break really expensive shit. But these biology and chemist people can actually hurt themselves. I mean, I've broken diamonds, lost samples, forgotten to load ruby into pressure cells, we use ruby fluorescence to determine pressure, and a whole bunch of other shit that costs quite a bit of time and money, but I've never almost infected myself or spilled acid on myself. The worst thing we have in my lab is silver paint. We had a grad student working with a relatively benign strain of Vibrio cholerae who didn't wear gloves or wash her hands before eating lunch. She got cholera. The doctors were baffled. We're in northern Canada, so cholera is not a thing. If you ever see a map of cholera cases, that one red dot in the middle of Canada is our lab. Had a small, table-type centrifuge that had its inner lid pop out when it was spinning. It bounced around inside by the rotor and got chopped to a million bits. It was a cheapo centrifuge, which was probably good because the parts were plastic and not terribly dangerous heavy. But bad because the outer lid popped open, too, sending those bits of plastic in all directions. I jumped up out of hiding to slam the cover down to prevent more projectiles. This was stupid because the damn thing decided to start spinning back up now that its lid was shut again. I think I yanked the cord from the outlet. What a piece of shit. We use ethanol to clean our cell culture room. One of the grad students was working on cleaning the racks in our incubator and ended up spraying me right in the eyes. Like I know that we're supposed to be good at biology, but apparently physics is a whole different story. 20 years ago, I dropped a 4-liter beaker. Instead of getting away from falling glassware, as we are all trained to do, I tried to catch it. The beaker struck the bench and shattered just as my hand went through it. It shaved off the side of my right middle finger. Went to the ER, but there wasn't enough skin to stick, just had to leave it open and wrapped for weeks until the tissue scarred over. I've now got a large keloid scar on that finger, which always reminds me to be more careful. I'm now our laboratory safety officer and use it as an example for laboratory safety. Working with antibiotic-resistant, bioluminescent E. coli, we inserted the bioluminescence gene from jellyfish into E. coli. One student jokingly offered another student $20 to lick the petri dish. Everyone thought he was kidding. Nope. The kid licked the plate, collected his $20, and was then out of class for a week with glow-in-the-dark diarrhea. I wasn't actually present for this particular occurrence, but apparently someone left a hydrogen tank open. Somehow a flame became involved, and the thick brick wall separating our lab from the hallway was blown clean through. In our bacteriology lab, we used to vacuum filter cold brew coffee in unused flasks because gravity took a really long time. We used thick-walled filter flasks, but one day, we got the idea that since we needed a larger flask to hold all of the volume, we'd just use a regular Ferrell Erlenmeyer with a 2-port stopper, and you can see where this is going. The walls couldn't stand the pressure, and a Ferrell flask very loudly imploded almost entirely to dust right on the benchtop. Luckily we escaped with a few tiny cuts, but I imagine it could have been a lot worse. Edit. I also saw a student attempt to flame sterilize a raining micropipette, melted the shaft nicely. Back in university, I was in a physics lab. Don't remember the exact equipment being used for the experiments, but the long and short is that a short girl working at one of the stations somehow had her long coat up on the counter. She didn't notice, and I saw just as she was hopping up off her stool that it was caught in under some piece of equipment. As she vaulted up and away from the table, it pulled the device, and then everything beside it off the edge of the table. The sound of a few $1,000s of equipment smashing on the floor is deafening. Edit. Spelling. When I first joined my lab, a grad student created a bomb. It wasn't intentional, but he sealed a glass bottle of isopropyl alcohol he had just used with dry ice to flash freeze glycerol stocks. It exploded as soon as it came up to room temp, sending shrapnel through the lab, breaking more bottles and embedding itself in the ceiling. Somehow it didn't hit a single person, and that guy has his PhD. The last time something horrible happened in a lab was in high school, even though I work in a lab now. Junior year in high school, we were doing cat dissections in an anatomy lab. The cats were euthanized from a shelter, so they were mostly quite lean, except my groups. It must have been a pet that got lost, because this poor cat was seriously obese. It had an inch-thick layer of fat coating the whole torso, and we had to spend days putting off the fat in order to get to the muscles. The fat had a very slimy, greasy texture, but it is held on firmly by connective tissue, fascia. One girl must have ripped too hard, because chunks of fat flew into her face, eyes, and mouth. She also fainted from the smell and knocked her head on the floor afterwards. Molecular biology student here. My research mentor was telling me a story yesterday about one of his laboratory accidents. He was setting up a bacterial transformation which requires sterile technique. In our lab we use a combination of a Bunsen burner and 70% ETOH to kill any unwanted critters and keep the cells we want uncontaminated. Unfortunately, ethanol has a tendency to vaporize quite rapidly on warm days, so when setting up a particularly large group of transformations, enough ethanol vaporized to reach the flame of the Bunsen burner, which set the whole beaker on fire. I used to check the cleanliness of glassware by sniffing. This stopped when I checked a beaker that had previously held ether. Also, I was distilling lime oil, I work for a flavor company, and forgot to open the vacuum valve. So, instead of the vapor being pulled through the still, it collected and built pressure. This resulted in a stopper blowing out and filling the room with green, citrusy vapor. TLDR, green fumes, but at least the Joker didn't come out of them. Edit, ether, not either. The resident idiot in our lab got suspended after his decision to put concentrated HF, 40% WWP into a glass beaker in the fume hood. For those who don't know, HF eats through glass pretty rapidly, it should always be kept in plastic. Anyway, he panicked and tried to mop it up with the paper towels, which were to hand, just spreading it around. Eventually someone thought to throw calcium carbonate over the spill to neutralize it. But not before it had eaten a hole through the fume hood and the cupboard below. Again, labs are only as safe as the stupidest person there. Someone turned on the high vac line and forgot to close one of the tap. Liquid nitrogen trap was used. When the Dewar flask was removed, the whole trap glowed blue. Everyone in the lab was evacuated. My mum did a PhD in biochemistry, and when working in a lab postdoctorate, she was working with a man who seemed completely normal. They would joke, and he had a really good relationship with everyone in the lab at the time. One morning, when they came in, someone found him in one of the back rooms, with a note attached to his shirt that said, "I have taken cyanide, do not resuscitate." They phoned an ambulance, but he had died hours earlier. Turns out he had spent the evening synthesizing cyanide and used it to kill himself. I was doing research in an organic chemistry lab a few years ago, and my partner accidentally spilled heavily concentrated acid, most of which landed on my shoe. Luckily they were corporate casual slip-on shoes made by Doc Martens with very thick quality leather. I was able to slip my foot out before the acid burned through the shoe, and eventually the sole. I owe you one, Doc Marten. We very nearly killed someone with electric shock, slightly before my time in the lab. I work in a lab with big 2 Tesla plus magnets, and they need a very big current source to power them. Sometimes the current sources need to be switched between magnets and other devices. So this one time one of the undergrads went to switch THS current source cables between a couple of magnets without making sure the power was off. Luckily, there were other people in the room that saw him go down, and the medical team arrived quickly enough to restart his heart without much permanent damage. Back when I was working at NE, I saw a postdoc get fired for not washing his hands. We'll call him Jake. Part of Jake's job was to come in on weekends and feed cells. Well, the lab cell cultures kept getting infected, and nobody knew why until we looked under a microscope and identified the infection as a type of bacteria found specifically on poop, forget the name ATM. The lab eventually confronted Jake and he promised to do better. I should mention that Jake was reprimanded for this 3 separate times before he finally got the boot. This wasn't me, but my teacher when he was in college. A girl spilled a very strong base on her leg. She made the split-second decision to pour a really strong acid on her leg, thinking they would cancel each other out. She forgot that would create heat and burn the shit out of her leg. This actually happened today. I'm sure there's been worse, but this is obviously fresh in my mind. I was doing behavioral assays and dissections of mice treated with MPTP, an incredibly potent neurotoxin that induces immediate Parkinsonian syndrome. The mice aren't supposed to have any of the chemical on them anymore, but of course it's possible that some is embedded in their fur due to grooming, and we were in full PPE gear in the hot lab. On my 10th or so mouse, dissection scissors are covered in blood and fur at this point. My scissors accidentally slipped through the skin and I stabbed myself with the potentially contaminated scissors. I guess we'll see if I get PD this week. My mentor was trying to identify antibodies that would bind to anthrax toxins and neutralize them. So she was testing whether the antibody from her initial screening binds to the toxin, and if so, what the binding would look like. And as she was loading the toxin antibody complex to the machine, she accidentally injected herself with the sample. Yep, she was exposed to one of the anthrax toxins. She didn't develop subsequent symptoms though, so we'd like to believe that it's because her antibody worked. My BF is finishing his PhD in chemistry and he has a few stories. The one that I think is the worst was an undergrad didn't tie her hair up while using a lathe. There was also a student who wasn't paying attention when grabbing for some acid, set it down too hard and some splashed up into her eyes. I don't know if it was a boy or girl. My BF would say the worst he knows of was when a professor put a cap on something that should have been vented and ended up blowing up the lab. Miraculously no one was injured. It took a while for the pressure to build, so the lab was empty when the explosion happened. Our lab decided to use Dropbox to share and store files. I, not trusting cloud storage, decided to keep an additional backup of the entire 12-person's lab's data. No one else had backups as they thought that was Dropbox's job. I go on vacation for a week. Pretty much day 1 of vacation someone got the message their Dropbox is getting full, so they deleted everyone else's data from their Dropbox, and Dropbox recovery did not work. Panic ensued, and after 2 days without email access, I finally see the chain of 400 emails. On the plus side, I was the tech hero of the lab for recovering the data remotely. I did not tell them I had a backup and all I did was email my roommate to copy-paste it. Lab tech was not using her grounding strap while working with heptane. While transporting the liquid outside the vent hood, there was an arc that lit her bowl of liquid heptane on fire. Since heptane burns quite clean, she was unaware of the fire until she poured the solution into the waste bin. The explosion of flame set off the CO2 fire suppression system to the whole production facility. Something like $1 million to clean the facility, recoup lost production, and recharge the system. She luckily only lost her job and her hair. TLDR, use your grounding strap, people. Had a master's student, finished up her thesis and left. Few months later we were looking for her lab books, but couldn't find them. Contacted her. I threw them out because my project was done. I didn't see it happen, but walked in shortly afterwards. It also happened over 10 years ago, so several details are lost in my memory. An honors lab student apparently had put a death grip on his glassware, causing it to shatter and tear up his hand. When I arrived at the building, there was an ambulance out front and I saw him being rushed to it through the hall, leaving a trail of blood. When I actually got to the lab, they were just finishing cleaning up the shattered glass and blood. Fortunately for the student, he didn't have any dangerous chemicals in the glassware. Lab manager in a chemistry lab. Postdoc puts a large amount of sulfuric acid in a 4L bottle labeled DMSO waste. Another postdoc empties the DMSO waste into the big organic waste barrel. When you mix sulfuric acid with organic solvents and water, it explodes. It melted postdoc 2's clothes. What happened to postdoc 1? She was promoted and made lab safety coordinator, pays to sleep with your boss. I was yelled at for not making the appropriate labels available to postdoc 1, they were at every sink. Sealed a vial containing HCl2 tightly, then put it in an oven. That's when I learned the classic saying, the difference between a good grad student and a great grad student is hiding your mistakes. Those not in chemistry. The HCl gas started billowing out of the oven, which I opened as I sprinted past and watched from the hallway. It was late at night and I was in my first year. Called my grad student mentor and we got it all cleaned up and he told me that helpful phrase. Never told my boss. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.